Hello? 911, please, someone, please help me.
911, what is your emergency?
It took her! A shark! It grabbed my wife!
Peak Bay, South Australia. On the surface, it's paradise. Rolling bushlands meet towering sea cliffs, and down below, hidden in folds of rocky Cove Serre, stretches of untouched white sand beaches kissed by the ocean. This is where the wind smells of salt and time slows to the rhythm of the tides. A place where tourists come to escape and where locals come to breathe. But beneath the postcard perfection lies something ancient, something hungry. The waters off Port Lincoln are no ordinary waters. These depths host one of the largest populations of great white sharks anywhere on Earth. Majestic, mysterious, merciless, and yet ironic attacks are incredibly rare here. Most visitors never even see a fin. In fact, the last time a shark killed anyone in these waters was nearly a decade ago. But that calm was about to shatter, because lurking just beyond the shallows was a predator no one saw coming, and a family who believed they were safe was about to be torn apart. For Shirley Durdin and her husband Barry, life by the sea wasn't just a casual dream, it was salvation. They had spent years in the dusty town of Carcoo, a small inland farming community nestled in South Australia's rural belly. But the dust, the livestock, and the pollens had become too much. Barry's allergies were getting worse. Farm life, once tolerable, had turned into a slow form of suffocation, so they made a choice, one that so many others only ever talk about. They sold everything, packed up their lives, and moved to the coast, to the freedom of the ocean air, to a future filled with salt, sand, and serenity. The sea was their fresh start, and for a little while, it worked. Shirley was 33 years old, a devoted mother of four, bright, loving, and always the first to dive into any adventure. Barry adored her. Their kids, still young, thrived under her calm spirit. And now, by the coast of Port Lincoln, the family seemed to glow in a way they hadn't in years. They had only been living by Peak Bay for a few short months when it happened. It was a warm Sunday, March 3rd, 1985. One of those rare golden days where the water glistened like glass and the air hung warm and windless. The kind of day that practically begged you to head to the beach. So they did. Shirley and Barry packed up the car with towels, snacks, and snorkel gear. Their four kids bounced with excitement. Joining them was a close family friend, Keith Coventry, a man who had known Shirley and Barry since their early days in Carcoo. Together, they set off for Wiseman's Beach, a secluded spot that looked more like a lagoon than an ocean front. Calm, quiet, safe. When they arrived, the beach was nearly empty, just a few footprints in the sand and the distant screech of seabirds circling overhead. It was perfect. The plan was simple. The three adults would go out for a short scallop dive while the kids played safely on shore. The water was shallow, just 7 feet deep, even at the farthest edge of the bay, on crystal clear. You could see the sea bottom with your bare eyes. Barry and Shirley helped the kids settle into the sand, built a quick shelter, gave them stern instructions: "Don't go near the water. We won't be far." The children nodded, but their minds were already on sandcastles and beach games. Shirley turned back to them one last time, her voice light and smiling. "We'll be right there, just a few meters away." They waved. That would be the last time they saw their mother whole. The trio waded into the sea. The sun shimmered on the water. Their bodies gently bobbed in the shallows as they slipped on masks, flippers, and snorkels. Everything felt relaxed, slow, simple. Below the surface, scallops lay scattered like seashells, ripe for the taking. Shirley loved it. She felt alive down there, free from the weight of the world. As the three of them scoured the ocean floor, they spoke through hand signals and bubbles, floating slowly above the seagrass. It didn't take long to fill their mesh bags with scallops. Within 20 minutes, Barry and Keith had their share. They surfaced, grinning like schoolboys, and began their slow swim back to shore. On land, the children giggled and played, oblivious to the deadly presence drifting just offshore. Shirley stayed back. She had spotted a cluster of large scallops wedged between two rocks. She couldn't resist. Always the overachiever, always the one who'd say just a little more. Beneath the blue, she moved gently, collecting one, then another, and another. Meanwhile, Barry and Keith stood ankle-deep in the shallows, pulling off their masks and chatting. "I bet I got more than you," Barry teased. "We'll see about that," Keith grinned. Neither of them noticed the shadow gliding silently beneath the waves. It had already seen her, just beyond the calm lagoon waters. A massive shape moved slow at first, like a drifting cloud. A 22-foot great white shark, gliding low to the sea floor, sensing something. Sharks don't hunt with their eyes. They feel vibrations, subtle pulses in the water that signal life, movement, warm blood. They respond to frequency and desperation. And right now, Shirley Durdin was the only warm-blooded object left in the water. As she finally realized she had enough, Shirley turned. Slowly, calmly, she began to swim toward the surface, kicking gently, arms outstretched, scallop bag in hand. She didn't hear it, she didn't see it, but it was coming. The shark moved upward, closing the distance with terrifying efficiency, not in a burst but in a calculated, silent glide. It was assessing, approaching, locking its massive black eyes onto her silhouette. And then, with a force like a missile, the shark breached the surface. In a moment that could only be described as a living nightmare, it launched Shirley several feet into the air, her waist clenched between its jaws. Time seemed to stop. The sound of the splash, the crack of her bones, the screams from the shore. Barry's laughter stopped. Keith turned. The children froze. The shark landed back in the water, with Shirley's torso still in its grip. Then it began to thrash violently side to side, over and over, using a technique common to large sharks designed to rip flesh clean from bone. Within seconds, the water turned red. Shirley's body convulsed, then went limp. Her children stood in the sand, mouths open, unable to process what they were seeing. Barry dropped his bag and ran. "Shirley! Shirley!" He dove toward the water, but Keith grabbed him, yelling, crying, holding him back as the blood spread wider and wider across the tide. She's gone, Barry sobbed. They all watched helplessly as her torso floated face down, half a body where a whole woman once swam. The shark circled. Then it came back. In a final act of cold, predatory instinct, the great white bit off Shirley's head, then turned and vanished into the deep. There were no warning signs, no ominous music, no time to run, just 10 seconds of terror and a lifetime of silence. The water was red now, not blue, not clear, just red. Shirley's torso severed clean at the waist drifted slowly, face down, as the white bubbles from the shark's thrashing dispersed into pink foam. Her limbs hung loosely, her scallop bag still clutched in one hand. A woman who had entered the water whole just moments ago, now reduced to a floating horror. On shore, the silence was unbearable. Keith Coventry stood motionless, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes had just witnessed. Beside him, Barry collapsed to his knees, his face pale, his voice strangled. He'd tried to move, to swim, to save her, but what was there left to save? "Shirley, no, Shirley," he cried out, voice cracking, body trembling. The children had stopped playing. Their toys lay forgotten in the sand. One of them dropped a seashell and stepped forward slowly, uncertainly, as if trying to understand what was happening. They had seen the whole thing. Their mother in the air, the spray of blood, the gaping mouth of the shark, the flailing body, the silence afterward. Trauma doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like this, quiet, suffocating, and irreversible. But it wasn't over. Not yet. In a move so surreal it felt impossible, the shark returned. In full view of the beach, just a few feet away from where Barry now knelt, screaming, the great white rose once more from the water. This time there was no thrashing, no dramatic leap. The shark approached Shirley's drifting upper body with a terrifying calm. It opened its jaws and bit her head clean off. One quick, decisive motion, one final insult to an already unspeakable tragedy. Then, As if satisfied, it turned slowly and disappeared into the deep. It didn't rush. It didn't fear. It simply vanished. The beach was deathly quiet. Even the birds had stopped their endless chatter. Barry collapsed, sobbing, still trying to crawl forward into the shallows before Keith restrained him again. "It's gone, Barry, it's gone." But Barry wasn't listening. He was screaming her name over and over, trying to wake up from a nightmare that had become his new reality. The children didn't move. They just stared. One of them, too young to fully grasp, I tasked quietly, "Is Mommy coming back?" And there was no answer. There would never be an answer that made sense. Word spread quickly across the local community. Radios began to buzz with panic. "Shark attack. Wiseman's Beach. One confirmed dead. Woman taken." Emergency crews were dispatched immediately. Within an hour, the once quiet beach was flooded with sirens, officers, and paramedics. Barry sat wrapped in a towel, soaked and shivering, his face blank. The children huddled beside him, still in their swimsuits, eyes fixed on the sea that had taken everything from them. Shirley's body, what was left of it, was gone. Divers entered the water with hopes of retrieval, but they returned empty-handed. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats patrolled the shoreline. The family waited in silence, but the ocean kept its secret. In the days that followed, search efforts intensified. Dozens of Marine officers combed the bay, hoping to find at least a piece of her, something to bury, something to hold, something to prove she was more than just a memory. But nothing surfaced. No torso, no limbs, no remains. The official report concluded with chilling finality. Remains unrecovered, presumed consumed. Authorities believed the shark had returned a third and final time long after the family had left the beach to finish what it started. The attack shook Australia to its core. The sheer violence, the public setting, the fact that children had witnessed it. This wasn't a mysterious disappearance or a distant tragedy. This was a woman who had been eaten alive before her husband and children in the middle of a sunny afternoon. The media called it the most horrifying shark attack in modern history. And it was hard to argue. There were no blurred lines here, no unanswered questions, no mystery, only a brutal truth. A mother of 4 entered the sea and never came back. In the days that followed, grief turned into outrage. Locals demanded answers. Why wasn't the beach closed? Why didn't anyone warn them? Some called for a mass cull of sharks. "Kill the monster that did this," one man told a reporter. "We can't let them swim free after what we saw." But marine biologists pushed back. "This wasn't a rogue shark," one expert explained. "It was a hungry animal doing what apex predators have done for millions of years. This isn't murder. It's instinct." But for the Durdin family, there was no comfort in logic. There were no scientific terms that could numb the memory of what they saw. What they lost wasn't measurable. Barry eventually gave a statement to local police. His voice was hollow, his hands shaking. "She was swimming back," he said. "I could see her. She was almost here." He paused, then looked down. She didn't scream, not once. Trauma counselors were brought in to support the children. The youngest kept asking if the shark would bring Mommy back. The older two refused to speak at all for days. Even years later, locals say the children never truly returned to the beach. Some memories are tattoos burned into the skin of your soul. At a quiet vigil held on the bluffs above Wiseman's Beach, candles were lit. Neighbors stood with tears in their eyes. And in the darkness, with the waves crashing below, someone said, "We always thought the ocean was peaceful. We forgot it can also be a grave." And so, Shirley Durdin became more than just a statistic, more than just a name in a newspaper. She became a symbol of fragility, of how quickly things can change, of how even in paradise, monsters still swim. The ocean never gave her back. That was the conclusion. After days of waiting, searching, hoping, what had begun as a rescue mission turned quickly into a recovery effort, and then slowly into resignation. The South Australian Police Water Operations Unit deployed divers and boats to sweep the surrounding waters of Wiseman's Beach. They combed every rock crevice, every kelp forest, every shelf of the ocean floor. But Shirley Durden was gone entirely. No torso, no limbs, no trace. Her body had been fully consumed. Not a single shred of tissue was ever retrieved. To some, it sounded impossible. How could a human being vanish so completely? But marine biologists weren't surprised. They'd seen it before. The great white shark, especially one as large and aggressive as the one that attacked Shirley, can consume over 30 kilograms of flesh in a single feeding. Combine that with the ocean's natural scavengers, fish, crabs, eels, and it's entirely possible for a body to disappear within minutes, especially when torn apart in warm, shallow waters. The rescue boats returned to shore one by one. Barry watched them from the sand, arms wrapped around his children, eyes hollow. Every time he saw one approach, his heart would stutter only to fall again as they shook their heads. No remains, no closure. The final diver surfaced late in the afternoon on the fourth day. He removed his goggles, pulled himself into the boat, and spoke 3 words that would haunt Barry for the rest of his life. There's nothing left. The official search was called off. And just like that, the Durdin family was left with nothing but memories and trauma. No funeral, no grave, no ashes to scatter, only the sound of waves crashing against the shore, only the blood-stained tide that had long since washed itself clean. Media outlets swarmed the town of Port Lincoln. Helicopters hovered, cameras clicked. Reporters pushed microphones toward anyone with a tan and a snorkel. The Durdin family stayed silent. In their small rental home by the coast, curtains remained closed. The children didn't go outside. Barry didn't eat. Keith, racked with guilt, refused interviews and left town days later. Meanwhile, the headlines spread like wildfire. Eaten alive. Shark rips woman in half as family watches in horror. Blood in the bay. Paradise turns to hell for Aussie family. Great white terror returns after 9 years. But beyond the headlines, a deeper storm was brewing. Fear. In cafes and boardrooms, on fishing boats and bar counters, everyone asked the same question: could this happen again? People who once swam freely began looking twice at the water. Lifeguards in nearby towns reported record numbers of canceled dive tours and beach closures. Tourism dropped sharply in the following months. Wiseman's Beach, once a hidden gem, turned into a ghost lagoon. In the midst of all this panic, the debate ignited. Should the shark be hunted? Many believed so. It's a killer, one fisherman argued on live TV. That thing didn't just take a bite. It came back for her head. That's not natural. Others weren't so sure. Scientists from the Australian Marine Research Institute explained that this was not a targeted attack, but a rare feeding response. Shirley had likely been mistaken for a seal or dying prey, both of which are normal targets for a hungry great white. In the scientific community, Shirley's death was not murder, it was biology. But that answer, no matter how logical, didn't ease the pain. Logic doesn't help a child who saw their mother's body torn in half. Barry Durdin, in a short-written statement weeks later, said, "The ocean was her peace. It gave her calm, it gave her joy, and it took her from us." He never returned to Wiseman's Beach. Not even once. For the children, the trauma would last a lifetime. Counselors and psychologists came and went. They drew pictures. They were told to express their pain through colors and clay. But no color could paint what they had seen. No sculpture could bring back their mother. One of Shirley's daughters was quoted years later saying, "I remember her smile that morning, and the water turning red. I remember my dad screaming, and me not understanding why." The Durdin family eventually moved inland, back toward the countryside. But home never felt like home again. Friends reported that Barry never spoke of the ocean again. He sold their diving gear. He tore up beach photos. He refused to listen to the sound of waves. Shirley had been the glue of that family. And now she was gone and not lost, not buried, but eaten. There's a cruelty in that kind of ending that words can't soften. And yet, even through the horror, Shirley Durdin became something more than just a victim. Her story became a national conversation, a hard one. People were forced to confront the truth that nature is not safe, that the ocean, no matter how beautiful, is not tame. For decades we had swam in its shallows, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge its darkness. Shirley's story changed that. Safety regulations for open water divers were rewritten. New signage was placed at remote beaches, warning of shark activity. Local officials began restricting scallop diving in known shark habitats, especially during feeding seasons. And perhaps more importantly, the media began changing the way shark attacks were reported with more nuance, more science, and more humanity. No longer were they just gruesome headlines. They became moments of reflection. As for Wiseman's Beach, it sits quietly to this day, unchanged, untouched. The water is still clear, the sand still white, but the spirit of that place feels different. Visitors say there's a chill in the air, even on the hottest days. Locals still talk about Shirley. Some refuse to swim there. Others say they feel her presence when they look out across the waves. One woman said she once heard a child whisper, "This is where the water eats people." But perhaps what lingers most is the silence. The way an entire family stood and watched, powerless. The way paradise became a crime scene. The way a life ended so completely, so violently, that it left no physical trace behind. There are few deaths as total as Shirley's, and even fewer so deeply witnessed